She didn't flinch when the chair scraped across the concrete. The sound was sharp, almost violent in the silence of the briefing room, and it carried farther than it should have. Heads turned. Eyes followed. For a moment, it was as if the map glowing on the wall no longer mattered, only her presence did. Why were they watching her like that? Her gaze dropped to the table, to a crack in the wood that looked like a jagged river running across faded varnish. She traced it with her eyes as if memorizing its shape, as if studying that imperfection could keep her breathing steady. If she looked at the men around her, she'd see it. The doubt, the questions unspoken but thick in the air. The projection on the wall hummed softly. Terrain maps shifted. A cluster of red circles pulsed, enemy patrols, watch towers, kill zones. It was supposed to be a standard briefing. Another operation. Another name crossed off. But for her, this mission was different. For her, this map wasn't lines and markers. It was unfinished history. And history had a cruel way of returning. "Lieutenant," the commander's voice broke the stillness, direct, neutral but heavy in its own way. "You ready for this?" She felt her pulse catch in her throat. Every muscle wanted to stiffen, to retreat, but she forced air into her lungs. One breath, two. She raised her eyes. "Yes, sir." Her voice was calm, too calm maybe. Silence lingered, a shift of boots, the scratch of someone's pen. Then the commander turned back to the wall as if that was enough. But it wasn't enough for the others. She could feel their doubt, a low current humming just beneath the surface. They remembered her last mission. Everyone did. The one that fell apart. The one that swallowed good men whole. The one that left her standing in the smoke while the radio screamed static and the night closed in. They hadn't forgiven her. Maybe they never would. And she hadn't forgiven herself. She leaned forward, letting the map take over her focus. Her finger traced a path along the southern edge of the compound. "Here," she said quietly. "Less visibility. Their rotation leaves a 30-second window before the next sweep." Her words floated in the air, waiting, a pause. Then the commander gave the smallest nod. "South it is." It wasn't approval. It was acceptance, temporary, fragile, but she caught herself exhaling anyway. Hours later, the desert air wrapped itself around her like a shroud. Cold, dry, alive with silence. She adjusted the rifle strap across her chest, the weight grounding her in a world that threatened to drift away if she let her thoughts wander. The stars overhead burned sharp and unflinching. Out here, they seemed closer, crueler, like witnesses who had seen too much but said nothing. The team moved in practiced silence, shadows slipping across sand, breath held, steps measured. They were trained for this, every motion calculated, every sound weighed against the risk of discovery. But her mind was not silent, not tonight. Don't fail them, not again. Ahead, the compound rose out of the dark like a scar on the earth. Walls of stone and steel patched together by hands that didn't care for beauty, only for strength. A single floodlight hummed, its cone of yellow bleeding into the dust. The hum of a generator pulsed faintly in the distance, like a second heartbeat buried in the night. She raised a fist, halt. The squad froze, weapons angled, breaths locked. Her eyes narrowed. There, a guard, leaning against the wall, eyelids heavy, his rifle resting loosely against his leg. One mistake, one careless move, and all of this would fall apart. Her finger brushed against the trigger, her body instinctively aligning, a suppressed shot already in her mind's eye. One pull, one silent body crumpled into the dust, one obstacle erased. But orders weighed heavier than instinct. Capture mission, minimal casualties. She forced her hand down, exhaled. She gestured two men forward. They moved like wraiths, silent and sure, closing in on the half-asleep guard. In seconds he was on the ground, gagged, wrists bound, his breath harsh against the cloth. The silence held, no alarm, no shout. Her chest loosened, but only slightly. The guard's eyes found hers for one suspended moment before they pulled him away. Wide, terrified, and something else. Recognition. Her steps faltered for half a beat. Why that look? He didn't know her, couldn't, and yet the way he stared, it was as if he did. Her hand tightened on the rifle. She forced her eyes forward again. Not now, keep moving. But the question followed her like a shadow she couldn't shake. The southern breach was nothing more than a rusted sheet of metal leaning against broken stone. It fell away with a muted groan as they slipped inside. The corridor smelled of oil, sweat, and stale earth. A single bulb swayed overhead, casting jagged shadows across the walls. Every step echoed faintly, too loud as if the building itself was listening. "Clear left," one whispered. "Clear right," another breathed. They moved deeper. Every corner, every turn, carried the weight of possibility. Danger could rise from anywhere. She felt her heartbeat shift to match the rhythm of their boots. The steel door appeared ahead, reinforced, locked. She pressed her ear against it, a faint buzz. Voices muffled, distorted by static, a radio. Her fingers tapped a signal, breach. The charge went off with a dull thump. The door swung wide. Chaos burst open. Shouts in a language she half understood, panic laced in every syllable. Figures scrambled, weapons raised. The first shot cracked like lightning, stone chips spraying her cheek. Return fire answered, quick, controlled. The corridor flared with bursts of light, muzzle flashes carving ghosts into the walls. She dropped low, her body moving before thought. One breath, one trigger squeeze, a shadow fell, another breath, another shot. The room pulsed with violence, sharp and unrelenting. And then she saw him. Not just another figure in the chaos, not just another face. Him. The man whose orders had carved scars into villages she still saw in her dreams. The man whose name was burned into every report she had forced herself to read. The man whose shadow had followed her from the smoke of her last mission. He saw her too. And he didn't raise his weapon. He smiled. Her finger froze against the trigger. The chaos around her blurred, the shouts, the shots, the ricochet of rounds against concrete. It all thinned, dimmed, leaving only his face. That smile, cold, knowing. Like he had been waiting. The dawn crept into the horizon by the time they dragged him out in restraints. His wrists bound tight, his mouth gagged, but his eyes never wavered. That smile was gone now, but something lingered, carved deeper than flesh. She walked behind them, her boots crunching against the sand. The desert air was colder now, almost bitter. Her rifle hung heavy across her chest, her hands trembling only where no one could see. The others muttered in low tones, relief, frustration, relief again. Their voices were jagged edges of exhaustion. One of them, Ramirez, shifted closer. "You okay, LT?" His voice was quiet, not mocking, not sharp, just human. She wanted to say yes, to bury it beneath armor, but the word caught in her throat, strangled by the weight of everything she hadn't spoken. So she said nothing. Ramirez didn't press, just gave a slow nod and looked forward again. She was grateful for that silence. Her gaze slipped to the prisoner. His head bowed, shadows cutting across his face. But even there, even in that half-light, she could still see it. That smile. And in that moment, she knew the mission wasn't finished. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, when the team slept in fragments of exhausted silence, she lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling above her cot. The desert wind pressed faintly against the canvas walls, carrying with it whispers of dust. Her hands rested on her chest, fingers locked, as if holding herself together. Sleep refused to come, not with his face carved into her memory again, not with those eyes burning into her like old scars reopened. Why had he smiled? Why at her? Her breath shook once before she forced it steady. No answers tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but she knew one thing. The mission had only begun. And somewhere deep inside, where her grief had long ago broken into pieces, her courage stitched tighter. The broken edges pulled together into something unyielding, something that refused to let go. She would see this through, no matter what it cost. Why hadn't he spoken a single word? The ride back was long, too long, the kind where every second stretched thin, each bump of the armored transport rattling through bone. She sat across from him, the man in restraints, his eyes lowered but his silence louder than anything else. The engine's growl, the faint crackle of the radio, even Ramirez's occasional cough, none of it drowned out the silence between them. The others tried to ignore it. They talked about the mission, about ammo counts, about home, but she couldn't take her eyes off him, his wrists bound, his ankles chained, the weight of his presence filling the cabin more than his body ever could. And then it happened. He lifted his gaze, slowly, deliberately. Their eyes met. And there it was again. Not a smile this time, not quite, something else. A curve at the corner of his mouth like a secret pressed into silence. Her throat tightened. She forced her eyes away, staring instead at the passing blur of desert through the slit windows. But even then she felt it, that weight, that unspoken knowing. When the transport jolted to a halt at base, the others rose first, stretching stiff legs, grabbing gear. She followed last, her boots dragging against the ramp. The dawn light struck her face, sharp and merciless, as if the sun itself wanted to burn away her hesitation. But it didn't. It never did. The interrogation room was colder than the desert. Steel walls, one table bolted to the floor, a single bulb humming above, casting a pale circle of light that left corners swallowed in shadow. She stood behind the glass at first, arms crossed tight, watching as they sat him down. Shackles clinked against the chair legs, his face calm, still. The interrogator, an older man with a gravel voice and lines carved deep into his skin, leaned forward. Name. Silence. Your rank, your unit, where are they? Nothing. The interrogator's voice hardened. You can sit there all day, but the longer you do, the less patient I become. And still he just stared. She should have looked away, should have stepped back, but she couldn't. Something about the way his eyes flicked just once toward the glass where she stood, quick, almost imperceptible, but enough to tell her he knew. Knew she was watching. Her chest constricted. She wanted to storm in, to slam her fists on the table, to demand why he looked at her like that, but she stayed still, frozen. Because deep down she feared the answer. Later, when the team crowded into the mess hall, their voices filled the air with something that almost sounded normal. Laughter, short-lived. Complaints about food. Stories of home, retold with that tired bravado soldiers wore like armor. She sat among them, tray untouched, fork scraping at cold beans. "LT," Ramirez said, sliding onto the bench across from her. His smile was small but real. "You've been quiet since we got back." She raised her eyes, just tired. "Yeah, we're all tired," he said, his tone softened. "But I know that look, you've got something on your mind." She hesitated. The words were there, clawing at the back of her throat, but letting them out felt dangerous, vulnerable. Instead, she asked, "Why do you stay in this, after everything?" He blinked, caught off guard. "The job, the missions." She nodded. Ramirez exhaled, leaning back. His gaze drifted across the room. "Because if I didn't, I wouldn't know how to live with myself. My brother, he didn't come back from his last deployment. You think I can sit home, watching the news, knowing there's still men like him out there fighting, bleeding? Nah, I keep going because if I stop, then what was his sacrifice worth?" Her fork froze against the plate. The weight of his words pressed against her chest. "And you," Ramirez asked, his voice gentle now, "why do you stay?" She dropped her gaze. The answer burned inside her, but she couldn't give it voice, not yet. Because the truth wasn't about the mission. It wasn't about duty. It was about the faces she still saw in the smoke. faces that would never leave, faces she carried like a burden stitched into her soul. She stayed because she couldn't let their memory be the last word. But she said none of that, only pushed her tray away and stood. "Get some rest, LT," Ramirez said softly. She nodded, but her body felt hollow as she walked out. That night she couldn't sleep. The barracks were quiet, save for the faint rustle of sheets and the steady rhythm of breathing, but her mind replayed the interrogation room, his eyes, his silence. She turned onto her side, staring at the shadowed wall, her breath shallow, her chest heavy. She saw it again, the guard's face when they'd captured him, that flash of recognition, the prisoner's smile in the chaos, his glance through the glass. None of it made sense. Unless... Her hand pressed against her ribs, right where the shrapnel scar still lived, hidden beneath fabric. She closed her eyes. The memory surged again, unrelenting. The last mission, the smoke, the dust, the moment she realized she was alone. And in the distance, through the haze of fire, she remembered, just for a heartbeat, seeing a figure watching her. A silhouette she had thought was a hallucination, a fragment of shock. But what if it was? Her eyes snapped open. No, it couldn't be. But the thought burrowed deep. The next day the commander called her in. His office smelled of stale coffee and dust. Papers scattered across the desk, maps tacked to the wall. He didn't look up at first, just flipped through a folder. Finally he said, "He's not breaking, not yet, but he's not stonewalling either. He's waiting." She frowned. For what? "That's what we need to find out." The commander leaned back, eyes sharp. "I want you in that room with him." Her chest seized. "Sir, why me?" "Because he asked for you." Her breath faltered. She stared at him, searching his face for any hint of sarcasm, but there was none. Her stomach twisted. He had asked for her. Why? The interrogation room felt different this time, colder. The walls pressed closer, the air heavier. She sat across from him, her hands folded on the table. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "You know who I am." He didn't answer, just watched her. Her jaw tightened. "Why did you ask for me?" Finally, after hours of silence, his lips curved again. That same near smile. And when he spoke, his voice was low, calm, threaded with something that felt almost like pity. "Because you've seen what they hide from the others." Her breath hitched. The room seemed to shrink, the air colder still. "What are you talking about?" she pressed. But he only leaned back, chains rattling softly, eyes never leaving hers. And in that silence, she realized something terrifying. This mission wasn't about him. It was about her. Her heart hammered as she left the room, the sound of his words repeating in her skull. She stepped into the corridor, air rushing back into her lungs like she had been drowning. Ramirez was waiting there, leaning against the wall, his brow furrowed when he saw her face. "LT, what did he say?" She shook her head. "Nothing that makes sense." But the truth was worse. It made too much sense. That night, as the base fell quiet again, she sat alone on the edge of her cot. The desert wind howled faintly outside, brushing against the walls like a restless spirit. She pulled a photograph from her pocket, creased, worn, edges frayed. The faces on it smiled, frozen in time. Brothers in arms, friends, the ones who hadn't come back. Her thumb traced their faces, her breath trembled. She whispered into the silence, "I won't let you be forgotten." Her hand tightened around the photo. And somewhere in the darkness of her memory, his words echoed again. "You've seen what they hide from the others." Her resolve hardened. She would find out what that meant, even if it destroyed her. The day after the mission briefing was unlike any other for Layla. She woke before dawn, her body jolted awake not by an alarm, but by the quiet pressure that lived in her chest. Her tent was still, the canvas walls barely moving against the breath of the desert wind. She sat up, boots already laced by instinct, her hands trembling for reasons she refused to name. Today wasn't about routine training, not about the small drills or maintenance checks that had been her shield for so long. Today was about being trusted with a task no one believed she could handle. She stepped outside and the desert greeted her like it always did, cold in the morning, cruelly bright as the first light broke across the horizon. A convoy of vehicles hummed in the distance, their engines coughing smoke as mechanics prepped them for departure. Somewhere farther down the line, men she had trained beside adjusted their rifles, tested comms, laughed a little too loud at jokes that didn't mean anything. She knew those laughs were armor, a way to drown out the fear that no soldier ever admitted to feeling. But as she walked past them, their eyes followed her, not with camaraderie, not yet with respect, just with questions, the kind of questions that hung heavy and unspoken. Why her? Why now? Her assignment wasn't about prestige. It wasn't the kind of mission that made headlines or secured medals. It was reconnaissance, shadow work. She was to move with a two-man sniper team, positioning herself ahead of a battalion's advance into a hostile corridor where ambushes had already bled the company dry. It was dangerous because it required patience, invisibility, and precision. And it was grueling because success meant no one would even know she had been there at all. That was the paradox of the mission: survival and silence. Layla knew what the commanders didn't. Silence was the one battlefield she knew best. At the shooting range that morning, Sergeant Kieran, the sniper who had reluctantly been assigned as her partner, kept his distance. He adjusted his rifle with deliberate slowness, as though to remind her she wasn't welcome near his circle. The spotter, a younger corporal with dark eyes and a clipped accent, avoided her altogether, as though she were some dangerous rumor brought to life. "You'll slow us down," Kieran finally muttered, not looking at her. His voice was gravel, worn from years of smoke and desert grit. "This isn't academy training. Out there, one mistake and we're all names on a wall." Layla's jaw tightened, but she didn't answer right away. She lowered herself beside her own rifle, fingers tracing the familiar curve of its grip, the cool metal pressing against her palm like an old friend. "Then don't give me the chance to make a mistake," she said flatly. "Trust the work, not the name." It wasn't bravado, it was all she had, and for a moment she thought she caught the barest flicker of surprise in his eyes. The convoy rolled out before noon. Dust swallowed everything, rising in choking clouds as armored trucks groaned forward over uneven ground. Layla rode in the back of one, pressed between crates of supplies and the sharp stink of diesel. The rhythmic bounce of the wheels became a lull, a cruel reminder that these long rides always gave you too much time to think. She closed her eyes, remembering her father. His shadow had followed her since childhood, etched deeper into her life with every story told in hushed tones. Colonel Farid, the man whose leadership had saved an entire brigade, whose scars became legends, whose silence became command. People said he carried his soldiers like family, that he looked every recruit in the eye and made them believe they mattered. But he had never looked at her that way. He had never asked her why she wanted this life, never asked if she was ready to inherit the burden of his name. And maybe that was why the world doubted her now, because he had never told them otherwise. The convoy jolted to a stop. A voice barked orders from the lead truck, the sharp sound slicing her memories apart. She opened her eyes. Ahead lay the valley they would enter, the valley that had swallowed platoons whole. Her hand drifted unconsciously to the rifle slung across her chest. Whatever happened next, she couldn't afford to think about names anymore. Only survival. They dismounted and moved fast, cutting across the rocky terrain toward the ridge that overlooked the valley. The air was heavy, every sound magnified, the crunch of boots, the metallic shift of gear, even the rasp of her own breath. Layla felt the weight of the desert pressing down, as though the earth itself knew they didn't belong here. Kieran motioned for silence and dropped low, his eyes scanning the horizon through his scope. Layla mirrored him, flattening herself against the stone. She pressed her cheek to the ground, feeling the pulse of her own heartbeat thundering in her ear. It was strange, she thought. Fear didn't feel sharp anymore. It felt heavy, like a stone lodged deep inside her chest. Minutes stretched into an hour as they watched. Nothing moved in the valley below, just shadows shifting as the sun climbed higher. Sweat clung to her skin, stinging her eyes. Still, she didn't flinch, didn't wipe it away. She remained as still as the sniper beside her, her body becoming part of the ground. And then it happened. A flicker, a glint of something unnatural in the rocks ahead. The faint outline of a barrel sliding into place. Her throat went dry. "They're here," she whispered, her voice almost soundless. Kieran didn't respond, but she felt his body tense beside her. The spotter adjusted his lens, breathing out a sharp curse in his native tongue. It wasn't one rifle, it wasn't two. It was an entire line of them. The ambush was already set. Dozens of enemy snipers, positioned in a perfect arc, waiting for the convoy below to enter the kill zone. For one terrible heartbeat, Layla froze. This was the moment, the kind that decided whether stories ended or began. She thought of every doubt, every voice that had told her she didn't belong here. And then, with a steadiness she didn't know she had, she raised her rifle. "Mark the coordinates," she ordered the spotter. Her voice cut through the heat, sharp and calm. "Now." The corporal's eyes darted to Kieran, waiting for permission. Kieran hesitated, torn between instinct and disbelief. But Layla didn't wait. She adjusted her scope, exhaled slow, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked across the valley. The enemy's lead sniper, the one whose glint had betrayed the ambush, jerked back and vanished. The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. "Send the coordinates," Layla barked again, her tone brooking no argument. This time the spotter obeyed. And just like that, the trap was broken. Explosions ripped through the valley as Allied artillery rained down, guided by the coordinates she had marked. Dust and fire swallowed the ambush line, scattering enemy snipers before they could fire the first shot. The convoy below had no idea how close they had come to death. To them, the valley had just been another stretch of hostile ground. To Layla, it had been a knife's edge she had crossed and somehow survived. When the last shell fell and silence returned, Kieran finally turned to look at her. His face was unreadable, but his voice was quieter than before. "You just saved them," he said simply. Layla didn't answer. She couldn't. Her hands trembled where they gripped the rifle, but her eyes never left the valley. She wasn't sure if she had proved herself yet, but for the first time, the silence felt different. Not empty, but waiting. The smoke still hung over the valley long after the last shell fell, curling skyward in ragged plumes that looked too much like ghosts. The convoy rolled forward cautiously, its engines echoing like distant thunder against the jagged cliffs. Soldiers below would never know how close they had come to death. They would never know how thin the thread had been, how close the blade had pressed to their throats. But on the ridge, 3 soldiers knew, and one of them was no longer an afterthought. Kieran didn't speak to her immediately. He just sat there, his rifle laid across his knees, his weathered eyes locked on the valley as though memorizing every scar of fire and earth. The younger corporal busied himself with the radio, confirming the strike's effectiveness, reporting calm, clinical details that somehow felt obscene against the weight of what had just happened. Layla stayed silent, not because she had nothing to say, but because she didn't trust her own voice. The tremor in her hands had eased, but the echo of the shot, her shot, still reverberated inside her. For years she had been told she wasn't ready, that she didn't belong, that she was a shadow trying to walk in the daylight. But now here she had made a choice no one else had seen. She had fired the first bullet that saved them all. She wondered if her father would have noticed. By late afternoon, they had set up a temporary observation post farther along the ridge. Supplies were rationed out: water, protein packs, medical kits. The heat of the day bled into the cold bite of evening, and the desert became an entirely different battlefield. Shadows lengthened. Distant lights from unknown sources flickered in the valley. Every sound stretched longer in the silence. Kieran finally broke it. "You didn't hesitate." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even praise. Just an observation, but it carried more weight than either of them wanted to admit. "I couldn't," Layla said simply. She kept her eyes on the fading horizon, her rifle balanced across her lap like a piece of herself. He studied her for a long moment before leaning back against the rock. "Most would have frozen. Hell, I've seen men twice your size with half your burden lose their nerve when it mattered." The words were almost kind, almost. "Maybe freezing was never an option for me," she replied, her tone quiet, reflective. Kieran tilted his head, finally curious enough to ask the question that had hung unspoken since the mission began. "Why are you here, Layla Farid? Really?" The name landed like a stone between them. Her father's name. The legacy that weighed heavier than her gear, heavier than her rifle. She didn't answer right away. She thought of her childhood, of dinners eaten in silence because her father was already halfway back on the battlefield in his mind. She thought of the other soldiers who whispered about her at academy, how they said she was only there because of bloodlines, not merit. She thought of every time she had been passed over, pushed aside, underestimated. Finally she whispered, "Because silence follows me, always, and I needed to prove I could turn it into something more." Kieran said nothing, but he didn't look away, and in his silence she felt something she hadn't before. Not acceptance, not yet, but recognition. That night sleep was a stranger. The desert was alive with sounds, far-off gunfire, the cry of something wild and hungry in the cliffs, the rustle of wind dragging sand across stone. Layla lay awake beneath the thin cover of her cloak, staring at the stars that seemed too sharp, too endless. Her thoughts betrayed her, pulling her back into memories she had tried to bury. She was a child again, sitting on the porch of a house that smelled like dust and oil, her knees scraped from climbing trees she wasn't supposed to. Her father stood at the edge of the yard, still in uniform even though he was supposed to be home. His voice was always clipped, his eyes always scanning the horizon even when there was nothing there. "Strength isn't about being noticed," he had told her once, his back to her as he cleaned his weapon. "It's about being needed." She had carried those words like scripture, but he had never told her if he believed she could live them. Now, on this ridge, with lives hanging in the balance and her own heartbeat still too loud in her ears, she wondered if she finally understood what he had meant. Morning came harsh and fast. Orders crackled through the radio before the sun even cleared the horizon. Their observation team was to move deeper into hostile territory, shadowing the valley to confirm enemy movements. It was thankless work, dangerous work, the kind of work you gave to people you didn't expect to return. They moved in silence, their bodies weaving through jagged rock formations, slipping into shadows where the sun couldn't touch. Layla kept her steps measured, her rifle steady across her chest, her eyes scanning constantly for threats. Hours bled together in heat and thirst and vigilance. Every few minutes, the corporal would whisper updates into the radio, his voice barely audible above the wind. Kieran would pause to scan with his scope, his every motion deliberate, almost ritualistic. And Layla, she watched, she learned. She studied the rhythm of their work, the way they moved like a single organism, each part compensating for the other. She didn't try to force herself into it. She simply matched their pace, absorbed their silence, became part of it. And slowly, without words, they began to make room for her. By midday, they reached another vantage point overlooking a narrow stretch of road that cut through the valley like a scar. Enemy convoys had been sighted using the route, carrying weapons, supplies, reinforcements. It was a lifeline, and breaking it could starve entire cells of fighters. Kieran set up his rifle. The corporal adjusted his spotting scope, and Layla positioned herself just behind them, her own weapon steady. It didn't take long. Engines growled in the distance, faint at first, then louder, closer. A convoy of 6 trucks appeared, armored but not invincible, crawling along the road like prey that thought itself predator. Kieran exhaled, adjusted his scope and fired. The first truck erupted in fire, its wheels twisting as it collapsed against the rocks. The convoy halted in chaos, soldiers spilling out, shouting orders, scrambling for cover. The corporal called targets. Kieran fired again, and again. Each shot precise, each body falling like a piece removed from a game only he knew how to play. And then something shifted. Layla's scope caught movement beyond the convoy, a shimmer in the heat, too disciplined to be accident. Another ambush, waiting for their team to reveal themselves. Her blood ran cold. "Kieran," she whispered sharply, "right flank, 70 degrees." He didn't question. He swung his rifle, sighted and cursed under his breath. "They're waiting for us." It wasn't a convoy, it was bait. The trucks below weren't the real target. They were the distraction. The real kill lay in the snipers positioned on the ridge opposite theirs, waiting for Kieran's team to reveal their nest. Layla's heart hammered. She had seconds to choose. And then she moved. She rolled flat against the ground, adjusted her scope, and fired before Kieran could even bark a command. Her shot cut clean through the enemy sniper's position, the faintest spark of metal giving her away. The rifle fell silent. But the shot gave her away too. Dust exploded near her cheek as a return bullet struck just inches from her. Another, then another. "Down," Kieran roared, dragging her into cover as rocks splintered above them. The corporal shouted coordinates into the radio, his voice tight, urgent, almost breaking. The ridge became fire and thunder. Layla pressed herself against the stone, her breath ragged, her hands steady despite the chaos. She looked at Kieran, whose face was taut with fury and fear, and for the first time she didn't flinch. "I saw what you didn't," she said, her voice hard, unyielding. For a long moment he just stared at her. And then slowly he nodded. The firefight lasted minutes, though it felt like hours. Artillery responded to their coordinates, ripping through the enemy's hidden line. Smoke rose once again into the endless sky, carrying with it the smell of scorched earth and shattered plans. When silence finally returned, it was heavier than before. They had survived again. But survival didn't feel like relief. It felt like a question. How many more times could they walk the knife's edge before it finally cut deep? That night, when they regrouped at a safe zone carved into the cliffside, Kieran finally broke the silence. "You're your father's daughter," he said quietly. His voice wasn't cruel anymore. It wasn't dismissive. It was heavy with something else, something that sounded like truth. But Layla shook her head. "No," she whispered, staring out at the desert where shadows swallowed the horizon. "I'm his silence, and I'm trying to turn it into a voice." Her words lingered, fragile yet unbreakable, carried away by the desert wind. And for the first time, Kieran didn't argue. He just listened. The safe zone wasn't safe. It was a hollow carved into stone, hidden from satellites, shielded from casual eyes, but Layla knew better. Safety wasn't about walls or shadows. Safety was a lie soldiers told themselves to survive one more night. And as the cold crept into her bones and the distant sound of gunfire rolled like thunder over forgotten valleys, she felt it again, that restlessness that never left her. She sat with her back against the wall, rifle balanced across her knees, her eyes half shut but never fully closing. The others were scattered nearby, too exhausted to care. The corporal's head lolled to one side, his breathing uneven but deep. Kieran was awake, of course. He was always awake, but he sat in silence, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The sound grated at her nerves. Scrape, pause, scrape, a rhythm older than words. Finally she whispered, "You don't trust me." The knife stopped. His eyes lifted, pale in the dim light. "Trust is earned." Her jaw tightened. "And what do you call what happened on the ridge? I saw what you didn't. If I hadn't fired." "You'd be dead right now," he cut in sharply. "Because you fired too soon. You exposed us before I gave the call." The air between them thickened. The corporal stirred in his sleep but didn't wake. "You think everything is timing," she whispered, her voice low, edged with the bite of truth. "But sometimes it's instinct, and instinct is all I've ever had." Kieran's gaze didn't waver. He set the knife down carefully, deliberately, like every motion of his life was controlled, measured, accounted for. Instinct without discipline is chaos, and chaos gets soldiers killed. Her pulse throbbed in her throat, but she forced herself to look away, into the shadows beyond the safe zone. "Maybe chaos is all that's left of me." Sleep never came. Instead, memories returned, sharp, relentless. She was 14 again, standing in her father's study, watching him polish his metals with quiet precision. The house was dark except for the faint glow of a desk lamp. She had asked him once why he never smiled at those metals. "They're not for smiling," he had said, his voice dry, brittle. "They're reminders." "Of what?" she asked. "That courage and loss look the same when you hold them long enough." She hadn't understood then. She did now. Every breath she took on this mission felt like one stolen from someone else. Every time she pulled a trigger, she wondered if her father would approve, or if approval was never the point. Maybe it was just about carrying the silence forward. Dawn brought new orders. They were to move again, farther north, closer to a village intelligence claimed was a staging ground for enemy fighters. The village wasn't marked on most maps. It wasn't protected, not fortified. Just another dot in a desert full of ghosts. But villages meant people, and people meant risk. They descended the ridge in silence, the heat rising with each step, sand clinging to their boots. The corporal hummed under his breath, maybe to keep himself sane. Kieran marched without a sound, his eyes scanning everything, every shadow, every rock. Layla kept her gaze on the horizon where faint traces of smoke curled upward. She knew that kind of smoke, cooking fires, families, children. Her stomach tightened. When they reached the village, the air changed. It smelled of bread baking in clay ovens, of goats penned nearby, of life that refused to yield to war. Children ran barefoot across dust-choked streets, their laughter thin, fragile but real. Women carried water in jars balanced expertly on their heads. Old men sat in circles, their eyes heavy, watching, always watching. The team walked like ghosts among them, rifles slung but ready, boots too heavy against the fragile ground. Layla felt every stare pierce through her. To them, she wasn't a soldier. She was an intruder, another shadow in a war that had stolen everything from them. And then she saw her. A little girl, maybe 10 years old, crouched near a doorway with a broken doll in her hands. Her eyes lifted when Layla passed, dark and wide, filled with something between fear and defiance. Layla's chest tightened. She slowed just for a moment, as if that child had reached into her and pulled out the piece she had been hiding all along. She remembered herself at that age, alone, watching her father walk out the door with a rifle and a promise he never kept. The girl's lips moved silently, a word Layla couldn't hear. And then just as quickly, the moment was gone. The girl turned away. But Layla carried her with her, deeper into the village, deeper into the weight of the mission. They set up surveillance in an abandoned house at the edge of the village, windows covered, scopes trained, radios alive with static. The hours stretched. Nothing moved except villagers living lives too fragile to break. But then, as the sun dipped low, shadows began to lengthen. Trucks rolled in from the north. Armed men stepped out, their rifles slung, their voices sharp. They moved through the village like wolves, pulling men aside, shouting orders, intimidating without a word. Layla's stomach turned. She recognized the ritual, recruitment, coercion. Another generation pressed into a war they hadn't chosen. Kieran's jaw clenched as he watched through his scope. Orders were right. This is a staging ground. The corporal's voice was tight. Command wants confirmation. We've got it. Do we call for strike? The question hung heavy. A strike would mean wiping the village from the map. Trucks, fighters, families, children, the little girl with the broken doll. Layla's throat went dry. She whispered before she could stop herself. There are civilians, too many. Kieran didn't look at her. Civilians are always caught in the middle. It's war. She turned on him, her voice sharp, trembling with something deeper than anger. No, that's surrender. That's saying their lives don't matter because it's easier to erase them than protect them. The corporal shifted uncomfortably, his radio still buzzing with half-heard orders. Kieran finally looked at her. His eyes were hard, but beneath the steel, something flickered, doubt, maybe, or memory. You think you can save them all? Her voice cracked, but she didn't care. I have to try, because if I stop trying, then I'm not a soldier anymore. I'm just another weapon pointed at the weak. The room went silent, except for the hum of the radio. Finally, Kieran exhaled, long, heavy, resigned. We delay the strike, we buy time, but if this goes wrong, it's on you. Her chest ached with something she couldn't name. Relief, fear, maybe both. That night, the village was alive with whispers. The fighters gathered in the square, their plans spilling out in fragments of words carried on the wind. Trucks loaded with weapons, maps spread on tables, coordinates marked. Layla crouched near the window, listening, every muscle coiled. Her mind burned with conflict. She wanted to stop them now, before the plan hardened. But one wrong move could mean the deaths of every civilian in the village. She thought of the little girl again. The broken doll, the unspoken word. And for the first time, she understood what had been missing all along. Her courage wasn't about proving herself to Kieran, or to her father's memory, or even to the military that doubted her. Her courage was about stitching every broken piece of her heart into something that could protect others, even if it cost her everything. And she knew what she had to do. Just before dawn, she slipped out of the safe house. Her boots moved silently through the narrow streets, past homes that smelled of smoke and bread, past sleeping children who had no idea the war was on their doorstep. She reached the edge of the square. The fighters were still there, huddled over maps, their rifles stacked nearby. Her hand tightened around her rifle. She could end it here. Now, one shot, then chaos, then maybe, just maybe, the villagers would have time to run. But her father's words returned, as if whispered across years and silence. Strength isn't about being noticed. It's about being needed. She lowered her weapon. Instead, she moved toward the villagers. Quietly, carefully, one house at a time, she woke them. Mothers, fathers, children, whispered warnings in broken words, gestures, anything they would understand. Her heart raced with every knock, every glance over her shoulder. She was risking the mission, her life, everything. But she kept moving. Because in that moment, courage wasn't a bullet. It was a voice breaking silence. By the time the sun cracked the horizon, the first villagers had begun to slip away. Families carrying what little they could, vanishing into the desert before the fighters noticed. Layla stood in the shadows, her rifle hidden, her breath shallow, watching them go. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was carrying her father's silence. She felt like she was rewriting it. The desert night carried a silence that was both comforting and deceptive. The stars glimmered above like icy shards scattered across black velvet, but the earth below was restless. Convoys rumbled through narrow roads. Radios hissed with coded chatter. And somewhere in that fragile stillness, Alina prepared for the mission that would decide not only the fate of her team, but perhaps the balance of power in a region teetering on collapse. The operation was called Iron Mirage, and it had been whispered about for months in intelligence circles. Rumors spoke of a hidden weapons cache, advanced missile systems capable of striking cities hundreds of miles away. If the enemy deployed them, Civilian blood would soak the soil long before any military could react. The brass had wanted someone precise, someone who could lead under pressure but also make a sniper's clean decision when seconds meant the difference between survival and catastrophe. And so, Alina found herself at the center of it all, her name inked in briefing packets, her dossier passed from command to command, her record scrutinized under the harsh light of necessity. But to Alina, the mission wasn't a test of skill. It was a vow that no one would silence her, that her place in history wouldn't be as a footnote of someone else's bravery. She would step forward, unbroken, unshaken, and unwilling to bend. The briefing. The hangar smelled of oil and dust, the kind that clung to your lungs long after you walked out. Inside, the team gathered around a battered metal table where maps were spread, red circles marking target sites. Captain Reeves, the team's commander, jabbed a finger at the largest mark, an abandoned refinery on the outskirts of the desert city. "Intel places the warheads here," he said, his gravel voice carrying no room for debate. "Guarded, fortified, and wired to the teeth. They know we're coming." Reeves's eyes swept the room. His soldiers, men carved by war, their faces lined with years of sleepless nights, stared back. Then, almost reluctantly, his gaze landed on Alina. "You'll take the overwatch position," he said. "High ground. Window for engagement is narrow. If they move the cargo, you eliminate." Alina gave a single nod. "Copy." She didn't need to say more. Her weapon would speak for her. But inside, she felt the thrum of nerves, the kind that soldiers pretended didn't exist but which lived in every heartbeat before a mission. She remembered her father's words, "Courage is just fear with a steady hand." She breathed those words in, let them settle into her bones, and steadied her hand. The approach. The convoy moved under the cloak of night. Trucks rolled over uneven dirt, headlights darkened to slivers. Drones whispered overhead, their soft whine blending into the wind. Every bump jarred Alina's ribs, but she stayed focused, her rifle clutched tight, her mind rehearsing every step. Reeves's voice came through the comms. 2 clicks out, final prep. The team dispersed into silence. Weapons were checked, magazines slammed into place, knives adjusted at belts. Alina slid the bolt of her rifle, the metallic click sharp in the night. The weapon felt alive in her hands, an extension of her breath and intent. She thought of the stories told about her behind closed doors, the whispers that she didn't belong, that she was a token of change rather than a soldier of worth. She let those whispers harden her resolve. Tonight, she wasn't there to prove them wrong. She was there to prove herself right. The refinery. They arrived just as the moon reached its zenith, bathing the desert in silver light. The refinery loomed in the distance, its skeletal towers like the bones of some long-dead beast. Floodlights bathed the perimeter, shadows packing between them, armed sentries, disciplined and alert. Alina scaled the rocks to the north, her body moving with a predator's patience. Dust scraped her palms. Her breathing was steady, measured. When she reached her perch, she set her rifle on its bipod, glassing the target zone through her scope. Below, she saw the enemy, a convoy of trucks backing into a warehouse, men shouting orders, crates being unloaded. And there, under tarps and chains, she glimpsed the unmistakable silhouette of missile canisters. Her throat tightened. The rumors were true. She pressed the comm. "Eyes on target, confirmed." Reeves's reply was curt, "Wait for my signal." So she waited. The scope's reticle hovered over shapes that were human and monstrous at the same time, men who carried weapons powerful enough to erase families, cities, futures. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, but her discipline held. Minutes stretched like hours, then chaos. Contact. The first explosion ripped through the southern fence, fire blooming into the night. The team breached with violent precision, gunfire echoing against steel towers. Shouts rose, alarms wailed. Elena tracked movement, her scope finding a hostile on the refinery's catwalk. One squeeze, one breath, and the man crumpled silently into the dark. Her world narrowed to glass and trigger, breath and release. She was death's whisper, unseen but everywhere. Each shot she took cut down a threat. Each second stretched thinner, more fragile. Through the chaos she heard Reeves shouting, "Push, push!" His men advanced, shadows against firelight. Then movement. She spotted a truck breaking away from the chaos, headlights flicking on. Through her scope she saw the tarp covering one of the canisters, half secured, slipping. Her chest clenched. They were trying to smuggle one out. "Elena, do you have it?" Reeves barked. "I have it. Take it down." Her finger pressed and the rifle bucked against her shoulder. The truck's windshield shattered. The driver slumped. The vehicle veered, smashing into a tower of rusted barrels before bursting into flames. The canister rolled free, its casing intact, smoke and fire engulfing the ground around it. She exhaled hard, sweat dripping down her brow. That single shot might have stopped a city from burning. But the night wasn't done with her yet. The sky burns. The refinery became a storm of fire. The enemy, cornered and desperate, unleashed rockets blindly into the dark. One screamed past Elena's perch, detonating in the rocks behind her. She felt the blast punch her lungs, shrapnel slicing into her arm. Blood ran warm down her sleeve, but her grip on the rifle didn't falter. Her ears rang. The world blurred, but through the haze she steadied her scope again. Below, Reeves and the others were pinned by suppressive fire, caught between storage tanks that threatened to ignite with every stray round. Elena's hand shook. Pain clawed at her nerves, but she locked her body into stillness, focused on her breathing and began picking them off one by one, their muzzles flashing, their shadows collapsing. Every pull of the trigger was a promise kept, a promise to her team, a promise to herself. By the time Reeves's voice cracked through the calm again, perimeter secure, package neutralized, the night was a graveyard of silence. Smoke curled into the stars, flames licked the sky, and Elena, bloodied and shaking, lowered her rifle at last. Aftermath. At dawn, the refinery was a ruin. Blackened steel twisted against the morning sun. The smell of ash and oil clung to everything. Elena sat on a boulder, her arm bandaged roughly, her rifle resting across her knees. Reeves approached, his face unreadable. He stood there a long moment before finally speaking. "You saved us." Elena looked up at him, her eyes raw from smoke and exhaustion. "We saved each other." He gave a rare nod, one of respect. Not pity, not skepticism, respect. And in that quiet, Elena felt the weight of history shifting. She had not been pushed aside. She had stepped into it fully, irreversibly. The night the sky burned was not the night she broke. It was the night she became unbreakable. The world didn't always recognize heroes. Sometimes it only recognized silence, the kind left behind after the noise of battle, when the smoke cleared and the cameras turned away. For Elena, the silence after the refinery mission felt heavier than the firefight itself. The operation had been cataloged as a success, weapons cache destroyed, enemy forces scattered, civilian lives spared. But in the shadows of bureaucracy, victory was often dressed in restraint. Reports were redacted, her name replaced with sterile identifiers like Operative 1 or Sniper Overwatch. To the outside world, she was invisible. But within the team, the silence was different. It wasn't the kind that erased. It was the kind that acknowledged. Men who once doubted her gave nods when she passed. Their eyes lingered a little longer, not out of skepticism, but out of something closer to respect. And yet, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that her fight was far from over. The hospital ward. The ward smelled of antiseptic and burned coffee. Beds lined the walls, filled with men wrapped in bandages, IVs dripping life into exhausted veins. Elena sat among them, her arms stitched but functional, her body aching from shrapnel wounds that pulsed like a second heartbeat. Reeves visited each soldier, his voice low, his presence commanding even in quiet. When he reached Alina's bed, he stopped, arms folded. "You shouldn't be walking yet," he said, eyes narrowing at the sight of her half-laced boots. She smirked faintly. "Walking isn't the problem, waiting is." His mouth twitched, almost a smile, before he set a small file on her bed. "Intel review, thought you'd want to see it." Inside the folder were photographs, grainy satellite images, intercepted transmissions, and finally, a picture of the refinery burning against the night sky. A single caption beneath it read, "Operation Iron Mirage success with civilian risk mitigated." Alina's eyes lingered on the flames, remembering the heat on her skin, the weight of the trigger. "Doesn't say much." "It never does," Reeves admitted. He leaned closer. "But the people who matter, they know who pulled the trigger that stopped a city from burning. Don't let the paperwork fool you." His words sank deep, not because they were grand, but because they were simple. And for once, she believed them. The call. Days later, Alina was summoned to the base's comms center. The corridors buzzed with chatter, boots striking polished floors, screens flickering with data. When she entered, a young lieutenant handed her a headset. "Direct call, Pentagon authorization," he said, his face pale with nerves. Alina adjusted the headset, the static resolving into a voice calm yet commanding. It wasn't Reeves. It wasn't her chain of command. It was higher, much higher. "Sergeant Alina Cortez," the voice said. "You don't know me, but I know you, and I know what you did." Her grip tightened. "Sir, there are those who will try to bury your name under red tape," the voice continued. "But history has a way of remembering what it wants. You've stepped into it whether you intended to or not. The question is, will you carry it further?" The line went quiet, leaving her with nothing but the echo of choice. The ceremony. Weeks later, the desert wind carried with it a strange anticipation. Soldiers assembled on the base's parade ground, their uniforms pressed, their boots aligned in perfect rows. Flags snapped in the wind, sunlight gleaming off brass insignias. Alina stood in formation, her wounds healed but her heart still carrying the weight of that night. She had been told nothing, only ordered to appear. When the general stepped onto the podium, silence fell. His speech was formal, the kind that spoke in phrases like valor under fire and distinguished service. Then he called her name. "Sergeant Alina Cortez." She stepped forward, boots heavy against the asphalt, the eyes of hundreds following her. The general pinned a medal to her chest, a simple piece of metal, yet heavier than any weapon she'd ever carried. Applause broke out, rolling across the ranks like thunder. But what struck her most wasn't the medal or the ceremony. It was the quiet nod from Reeves, the faint smile from the men who once doubted her. Respect had been earned not through speeches but through fire. And yet, as the crowd dispersed, Alina felt a strange emptiness. The medal shone, but it didn't erase the faces of those she had taken in the scope. It didn't quiet the questions that haunted her when the world went still. The weight of history. That night, alone in her barracks, Alina sat with the medal on her bunk. She turned it over in her hands, watching the way it caught the dim light. Was this what her father had meant by unbroken service? To carry not only the burden of action but also the silence that followed. To understand that history didn't live in parades or medals. It lived in the nights where a soldier stared at the ceiling, replaying every choice, every life ended, every life spared. Her father's voice returned, softer than memory. "The world won't always clap for you, but it will always need you." She closed her eyes, the medal cool in her palm. She wasn't sure if she felt proud or weary or both. Maybe that was the truth of it, that soldiers didn't fight for applause. They fought so others could live in ignorance of the cost. The conversation. The next morning, she found Reeves outside the mess hall, coffee steaming in his hand. He looked at her with the same unreadable eyes, but there was something different now, something less guarded. You carry it well, he said. The metal, she asked. The silence. Her chest tightened. It doesn't feel light. It never does, he replied. He sipped his coffee, then added, but it means you're one of us now, not because of the metal, because you understand. She studied him for a moment, realizing that beneath his hardened exterior lay a truth he rarely spoke aloud. Service wasn't about victory. It was about carrying weight so others didn't have to. The message. Later that week, Alina received a message from home. A letter from her younger sister, handwritten in uneven ink. They say you saved lives. I don't know how many, I just know I'm proud. Dad would be too. Tears stung her eyes as she folded the letter back into its envelope. For all the silence, for all the burdens, there were still voices that pierced through, voices that reminded her why she had stepped into history in the first place. The unbroken path. As the sun set over the desert, Alina stood on the ridge overlooking the base. The sky was a canvas of orange and crimson, the kind of beauty that seemed almost cruel after the ugliness of war. She thought about the refinery, the burning sky, the weight of the trigger. She thought about the metal resting in her bunk, about the voices on the comm, about the future she hadn't asked for but could no longer walk away from. And she realized something. Stepping into history wasn't about one night, one battle, one medal. It was about carrying the silence forward, unbroken, even when the world wasn't watching. The path stretched ahead of her, uncertain, heavy, but undeniably hers. And Alina, the daughter of unbroken service, stepped into it without hesitation. The rain began softly, tapping against the barracks window like a hesitant visitor. By nightfall, it grew heavier, pouring across the base until the world outside blurred into streaks of gray. Alina sat at her desk, pen poised above a blank sheet of paper. She had started letters before, dozens of them, to families of the fallen, to friends she had lost touch with, to her younger sister who always waited for news. But each time, the words collapsed under their own weight. Tonight was no different. Her fingers tightened on the pen. What could she possibly say that would make sense of all this? The silence answered her, nothing. She set the pen down, closed her eyes, and listened. The rain drowned out the base generators, the boots striking pavement, even the muffled laughter from the mess hall. It reminded her of childhood nights back home, when storms shook the windows of their small house and her father would sit awake by the door, watching the lightning. You stay still in a storm, he once told her, because storms don't last, but the choices you make in them, that's what stays. She didn't realize until now how much of him lived in her. The unexpected orders. Morning brought with it a knock at her door. A young corporal stood there, drenched in the lingering drizzle, his expression nervous. Sergeant Cortez, command wants you in the briefing room, immediately. Her stomach tightened. She thought the refinery mission had been the end of it. She thought maybe she'd earned a pause, but in war, pauses were myths. The room was smaller than before, fewer chairs, fewer maps. Reeves sat at the head of the table, files spread open like a deck of cards. He gestured for her to sit. This isn't an order, he began, which already made her suspicious. It's an ask. He slid a folder across the table. Inside, photographs of a border village, faces of children in dust-covered clothes, makeshift tents huddled against the desert wind. And then darker photographs, images of what had been done there. Alina's chest hollowed. Why me? Because you see what the others don't, Reeves said. Because you carry it. His words landed like stone. She had carried it, yes, every choice, every silence. But the thought of carrying more, it felt like a mountain pressing against her ribs. Yet she found herself nodding, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't turn away. The journey back. The convoy rolled across the desert at dawn, tires grinding against wet earth, engines low and steady. Alina sat in the lead vehicle, rifle resting across her knees, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The men were quieter this time. No nervous jokes, no complaints about rations or sleep, just the stillness of soldiers who knew too much. Ramirez, sitting across from her, finally broke the silence. "You ever wonder if we'll get out? Like, really get out? No more deployments, no more orders, just done." She studied him. The deep lines beneath his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly when the truck hit a bump. He wasn't much older than her, yet looked like he carried centuries. "I don't think it works like that," she said quietly. "Yeah," he muttered, "didn't think so." But the way he said it, Alina knew he wasn't looking for comfort, just acknowledgement. Sometimes that was enough. The village. When they arrived, the village was eerily still. Smoke clung to the edges of burned-out homes. The air smelled of ash and wet earth. Children peered from behind broken walls, their eyes wide and hollow. Alina stepped out of the vehicle, boots sinking into mud. The weight of their stares pierced her more than bullets ever could. She had been trained to engage enemies, to dismantle compounds, to protect through firepower. But this was something no rifle could fix. An old woman approached, her back bent, her hands shaking as she held out a photograph. Alina took it carefully. A young boy smiled in the faded image, his face bright with innocence. The old woman said nothing, but her eyes told the story. The boy was gone. Alina handed the photo back, her throat burning. She wanted to say, "I'm sorry." She wanted to promise justice, but words felt like dust here. Instead, she simply bowed her head. Sometimes silence spoke louder. The trap. They set up perimeter defenses, distributed what supplies they had, and began mapping out possible enemy return routes. It felt less like a mission and more like a vigil. But by nightfall the storm came, not rain this time but fire. Gunfire erupted from the hills, tracers slicing across the dark sky. The team scrambled into defensive positions, shouting coordinates, returning fire. Alina dropped behind a crumbling wall, scope raised. Through her lens she saw them, silhouettes moving fast, disciplined, coordinated. This wasn't random. This was an ambush. She steadied her breath. Target acquired, one shot, then another. Precision, discipline, but for every silhouette that fell, two more rose. Her earpiece crackled with Reeves' voice. "Hold your ground. Reinforcements inbound. 30 minutes." 30 minutes felt like a lifetime. The choice. In the chaos, Alina spotted movement near the tents. Civilians. Children caught in the crossfire. A shadow broke from the attackers, sprinting toward them with something clutched in his hands. Her stomach turned cold, explosive. Her rifle tracked him, crosshairs steady. One squeeze of the trigger and she could stop him, but she hesitated. His face, his age. He couldn't have been older than her sister. Her pulse thundered. 1 second, 2, 3. The memory of the old woman's photograph flashed in her mind. The boy who never came back. She pulled the trigger. The figure collapsed, the explosive rolling harmlessly into the mud. The children were pulled to safety. But Alina's hands wouldn't stop shaking. The dawn after. By the time reinforcements arrived, the hills were quiet. Smoke rose where gunfire had rained down hours before. The attackers had melted into the desert, leaving nothing but silence behind. Alina sat on the edge of a wall, rifle across her lap, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The metal back on base meant nothing now. The respect of her team meant little in this moment. What mattered were the faces of those children alive because of her choice, and the face of the boy she would never forget. Ramirez lowered himself beside her, his arm in a sling. "We made it," he said, as if trying to convince himself. She didn't answer. She only nodded, her throat too tight for words. The return. Weeks later, back at base, Alina was called again to a ceremony. Another medal, another round of applause, another speech about valor. She accepted it quietly, but when the applause ended, she didn't return to her bunk. She went to the ridge instead, where the desert stretched endlessly beneath the weight of the setting sun. The metal hung heavy on her chest, but it wasn't what she thought of. She thought of the rain, the photograph, the boy in her crosshairs. She thought of silence, the kind her father once told her about, the kind that lasted long after storms passed. The final reflection. Alina stood tall against the horizon, the desert wind tugging at her uniform, the world painted in fire and gold. She wasn't whole. She wasn't unbroken. But she was something else, something forged in silence, in storms, in the choices no one would ever fully understand. And in that silence, she realized the truth. Dignity didn't shout. It didn't demand recognition. Sometimes dignity didn't speak at all. It simply acted. Alina lowered her gaze, breathed once, and walked back toward the base. Not for medals, not for history, but for the unyielding resolve stitched into every broken piece of her heart. The world might never know her name, but it would live in the silence she carried. And that was enough.